The most powerful mafia boss in America, a man unstoppable by either the FBI or his enemies, is on the verge of being overthrown simply for daring to love a woman. Not because she's dangerous, not because she's a spy, just because she's 68 years old. When rumors spread, the entire mafia council erupts. They call him weak. They say he's lost his mind. They plan to kill both of them. But none of them know that. That woman has read their every move before they even act. Like and comment the city you're viewing to let me know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave, because what happens next won't let you breathe. The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning, and Don Rafael De Luca answered it before the second tone finished. He was already awake. He hadn't slept past 3 in the morning in 11 years. Not since the night his eldest son was buried in a closed casket on a Tuesday in November, and the rain came down so hard the gravediggers had to stop twice. Sleep had become something that happened to other people. Civilians, men without enemies, men whose hands hadn't done what his had done. He sat in the leather chair by the window of his study, the one that looked out over the back garden where the live oaks grew so thick the darkness underneath them was total. A glass of scotch, barely touched. A folder of names on the side table, half reviewed. The city beyond the garden wall breathed its quiet suburban lie. The houses dark, the streets empty, the whole neighborhood unaware that the man living behind the iron gate at number 14 Aldermere Drive was responsible for more bodies than the county hospital. "Tell me," he said. It was Carmine, his driver, his shadow, 22 years of loyalty compressed into a single voice that never changed register whether it was reporting weather or murders. "Somebody hit the Cavallo warehouse on 53rd. 3 of our men down. Andrade's crew, we think. They left the product, took the books." Rafael didn't move. The books meant the ledgers they kept in the back office. Paper, handwritten, the old way, because he'd never trusted servers or clouds or anything that lawyers could subpoena without a warrant. 3 warehouses had their own ledger systems, each with different codes, none of which meant anything without the corresponding cipher held at a separate location. If Andrade's people had the books, they had paper. They didn't have the key. "The men," Rafael said. "Paulie Greco, Tommy Sessa. The new one, Ferrante's kid." Rafael closed his eyes for a moment. Not grief, not exactly. More like the weight of arithmetic. Every man who died under his name was a calculation he'd failed to complete correctly in advance. "Families notified?" "I called Ferrante myself." "Good." He set the scotch down. "Bring the car around at 5. I want to see the warehouse before the city wakes up." He ended the call and sat in the dark for another 12 minutes, which was unusual. Normally, after a call like that, he'd be moving, already rerouting, already building the counterstroke in his head with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd been doing this since he was 26 years old. But tonight something slowed him. Not fear. Not doubt. Something harder to name. He looked at the desk drawer. Inside it was a book. Not a ledger. A regular book. Hardcover, worn at the corners, with a library stamp on the inside cover that read, "Westbrook College Library, deaccessioned," in faded red ink. The title was The Collapse of the Roman Republic, a study in institutional failure, and on the title page in handwriting that was small and precise and somehow both formal and warm at the same time, someone had written, "For the man who reads the newspaper but doesn't read history, E.B. Evelyn Brooks." Rafael opened the drawer and looked at the book for a long moment. He didn't take it out. He closed the drawer, stood up, and went to get dressed for the warehouse. He'd met her 14 months ago, and he still couldn't fully explain the mechanics of it. The Westbrook Philharmonic held a benefit concert every October in the old Hartwell Theater downtown, one of those civic rituals that the city's legitimate business community attended in black tie and called culture. Rafael attended every year because his late wife had loved the orchestra and because it was good optics. The De Luca Family Foundation was a major donor, and there was a plaque in the lobby, and it helped that the foundation's director was a retired federal prosecutor who had no idea who he was actually working for. Rafael sat in the donor's box on the left side of the mezzanine and endured 2 hours of music he didn't particularly feel, and shook hands with city councilmen and real estate developers, and smiled the smile he'd learned to wear so well it had become its own face. He'd stepped out during the intermission to use the men's room, and on his way back, he'd made a wrong turn. This was a genuine wrong turn, not something he'd engineered, and that detail still occasionally struck him as funny, in the particular way that things with no business being funny sometimes were. And he ended up in a side corridor near the archive room where the theater kept its old programs and production notes. There was a woman sitting on a folding chair outside the archive room door reading. In the corridor. Alone. During the intermission of a black tie benefit concert. She was wearing a dark green dress that was elegant without being showy, and she had silver hair cut close, and she was reading with the absolute focused stillness of someone who had entirely forgotten where they were. He'd said automatically, "Are you all right?" She'd looked up, not startled, just the composed pivot of someone who'd been aware of his presence for a moment before choosing to continue reading. She had a face that had lived in it, lines around the mouth and eyes that looked like they'd come from expressions worth having. She looked at him with a gaze that was direct and entirely unimpressed, which was something Rafael De Luca had not encountered from a stranger in a very long time. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "I just find the lobby unbearable during intermission. The wine is mediocre, and the conversations are worse." He laughed. It surprised him. He'd laughed, and it had felt like something cracking open in a wall he'd stopped noticing. "What are you reading?" he asked. She held up the book. The Peloponnesian War, Thucydides. She was reading Thucydides in the corridor of a theater during a benefit concert. "I'm Raphael," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Your name is on the plaque in the lobby. You gave them $400,000. Does that impress you?" She considered him. "It tells me you have money, and you want people to think you care about culture. Whether it impresses me depends on whether you actually listen to the first half." He sat down on the folding chair beside hers, which was not something he had planned to do. "I thought the second movement was better than the third. Most people think the opposite. Most people are wrong about a lot of things." She looked at him for a moment, and then she went back to her book. And he sat there, and they didn't say anything else until the bell rang for the second half. And they both stood up, and she said her name was Evelyn. And she was a retired professor, and she'd come because one of her former students was playing second violin, and she found it difficult to sit through the reception afterward, because people kept asking her what she was retired from, and then looking disappointed when she said history. "Why disappointed?" Raphael asked. "Because they wanted me to say medicine or law," she said. "Something that makes sense as the reason a person might have money." She paused. "I don't have money. I come every year because Marcus, my former student, he sends me a ticket." Raphael walked her back into the theater. He did not sit in the donor's box. He sat beside her in the general mezzanine, and she didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. And by the time the concert was over, he had asked if he could call her, and she had said, with the kind of composure that he suspected was genuine rather than practiced, "That depends on what you'd want to talk about." "History," he said. "I want to talk about history." "Then yes," she said. "You can call." He didn't tell anyone about her for 3 months. This wasn't calculation exactly, though later people would assume it was. It was more that there was nothing to tell, at first. They had dinner twice, the second time at a small restaurant in a neighborhood his men didn't normally cover, and they talked for 4 hours about the fall of the Roman Senate and the structural similarities between late Republican patronage networks and modern political machine politics, and she asked questions with a sharpness that reminded him of the best interrogators he'd ever dealt with, except that her intent wasn't to trap him, but to actually understand his answers. When he said something wrong or imprecise, she told him so, without softening it, which was also something he hadn't experienced from another person in years. Most people who spoke to Rafael De Luca were in some state of managing him, even the ones who liked him. The third time they met, at her apartment, a faculty housing unit she still kept through some legacy arrangement with the university, full of books and papers, and a cat named Herodotus who was hostile to strangers and immediately climbed onto Raphael's jacket. She made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table, and she said, out of nowhere, "You're going to have to decide how much of the truth you're going to tell me, and when." He looked at her. "I'm not naive," she said. "I was married for 21 years to a man who worked for the state attorney's office. I've read enough about organized crime to understand what the DeLuca Foundation probably is. I'm not asking you to confess anything. I'm telling you that whatever you tell me, it should be the truth, because I have no patience for liars, and I'll know the difference." He was quiet for a long time. "You're not afraid?" he finally said. "Of you?" She looked mildly offended. "Raphael, I grew up in East Baltimore in the 1960s. I've been afraid of things that would give you nightmares. You're just a man." He told her the truth. Not everything. Not the operational details, not the names, not the specifics of anything that could be used in a courtroom, but the broad shape of it. Who he was. What the family was. What he'd inherited and what he'd chosen, and where. In his honest accounting, those two things were different. He talked for over an hour, and she listened with the same attention she gave a student's thesis. And when he was finished, she refilled his coffee and said, "You understand that love and morality are different categories." "I'm not sure what that means." "It means I'm not prepared to approve of your life just because I find your company valuable. But I'm also not prepared to pretend the company isn't valuable just because I don't approve of your life." She looked at him steadily. "I'm 78 years old." 68, he said. "A slip. 68. My point is that I've earned the right to be complicated about things." He nodded slowly. "So have I." Sam. Carmine picked him up at 5 sharp, and they drove through the empty city in silence, which was their usual mode. Carmine was 50, built like a refrigerator someone had taught to drive, and he had an instinctive social intelligence that expressed itself mostly as knowing when not to speak. He'd noticed the change in Raphael over the past year. He hadn't said anything, but he'd noticed, because Carmine noticed everything and kept most of it to himself the way deep water keeps things. The warehouse was on 53rd Street in the industrial corridor south of the rail yards, a block of loading bays and cold storage that the family had held through a series of shell companies for nearly a decade. The police were gone by the time they arrived. A phone call from someone in the right place had delayed the official report, buying them 2 hours. The bodies had been removed. What remained was the mess: overturned shelving, broken pallets, the smell of gunpowder that had settled into the concrete like it had been poured there. Raphael walked through it slowly, hands in his coat pockets, reading the scene the way some men read text. He'd been doing this since before Carmine was old enough to carry a gun. The entry point was the loading bay on the south side. Forced, but not rushed. They'd had a key or a copy of one. The bodies had been found in a cluster near the office door, which meant they'd been driven toward it rather than running for it, which meant there had been enough of Andrade's men to herd 3 armed guards. A dozen, at minimum. This wasn't a robbery, this was a demonstration. "The Cavallo people," he said quietly to the man standing near the office door. Enzo Marchetti, his head of operations in this district, a thin man with gray at his temples who'd been with the family for 18 years. "When did they last report?" "Yesterday morning. Normal check-in." "Nothing unusual?" "No unusual vehicles on the block? No unfamiliar faces in the neighborhood the past week?" Enzo hesitated. Half a second, maybe less. But Raphael had spent 30 years reading half-second hesitations. There was something. One of the guys on the overnight mentioned a car parked on the corner that wasn't usually there. White sedan. He checked it out. It was gone. He mentioned it in the log? No. Why not? "I think—" Enzo stopped. Enzo. I think he was told not to. The silence in the warehouse had a specific weight now. Raphael looked at the floor for a moment, at a dark stain in the concrete that might have been oil or might have been older than that. He thought about Evelyn's kitchen table and the way Herodotus had climbed onto his jacket and the coffee that was better than anything served in any restaurant he'd ever paid $400 to eat in. "Who told him that?" Raphael said. Not a question. The tone of a man who already knew the answer was in the building somewhere and was deciding when to reach for it. Enzo didn't answer, and that was its own answer. "Go home," Raphael told him. "Don't call anyone. Don't go anywhere except home." "Don Raphael." "Home, Enzo." He watched the man leave. Carmine appeared at his shoulder like weather. "How bad?" Carmine asked. "Bad," Raphael said. "We have a problem inside. The drive back to Aldermere Drive took 40 minutes in the pre-dawn emptiness. Raphael sat in the back seat and watched the city scroll past, the dark store windows, the yellow-lit diners, the bridges over the river with their reflecting lights, and tried to locate the feeling with any precision. Not fear, still not fear. He hadn't operated on fear in a long time. It was a fuel that burned too fast. What he felt was more like the cold clarity that came from understanding the geometry of a situation, seeing where the lines were going to converge. Someone inside the operation had flagged the warehouse to Andrade. The guard's silence about the car meant it had been bought or pressured at the mid-level. Mid-level meant it had been organized above mid-level. Organized meant it was deliberate, sustained, and had a purpose beyond one warehouse raid. They'd taken the books. The books were useless without the cipher, but the attempt to take them meant someone either didn't know about the cipher system or was hoping to find the keys separately. Someone who didn't fully understand how he operated. That narrowed it. He pulled out his phone and opened the last text from Evelyn, sent the previous afternoon. It was a quote. She did this occasionally, sent him passages without context, and waited to see what he made of them. This one was from Thucydides. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. He'd read it and then texted back, "You're going to tell me that's wrong." She'd replied, "I'm going to tell you Thucydides was describing what happens in the absence of other options." He was not prescribing it. He put the phone away. His son Marco was waiting at the house. This was unexpected. Marco was 29, Raphael's younger son, and the one who was actually in the family business. His older son Dante had escaped it cleanly, living in Portland now with a wife and 2 children and a landscape architecture firm. And Raphael had been deliberately protective of that escape in ways Marco resented and Dante didn't fully understand. Marco had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the kind of restless aggression that was either an asset or a liability, depending on whether it was pointed at the right thing. He was standing in the front hallway, still in his jacket from the night before, which meant he'd been somewhere else until recently and had come directly here instead of going home. Raphael noticed this without remarking on it. "You heard," Raphael said. "The whole city heard. Andrade hit a DeLuca warehouse and walked out clean. That's going to be everywhere by noon." "I know." "Then you know what they're going to say." Marco followed him down the hallway toward the study. "The other families, the commission people, they're going to say, Marco, they're going to say you're not paying attention, that you're distracted." The word landed with a weight that wasn't entirely about the warehouse. Raphael went to the window. The garden was beginning to separate itself from the darkness, the oaks taking shape against a sky that was turning the color of old iron. "Say what you want to say." Marco stood in the doorway. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. When he spoke, his voice had the careful tone of something rehearsed. "The men are talking about the professor. They have been for a while. I've been telling them it's not what they're making it into. But after tonight, people are going to connect things that maybe aren't connected." "And what are they connecting?" "That since you started seeing her, you've been different, slower, more willing to let things sit. The Andrade business last spring, you let that go when 6 months ago you would have moved fast. The situation with the Callaway docks, you handed it to Fabri instead of—" "I delegated to Fabri because Fabri handles the docks," Raphael said quietly. "Because that's what delegating is. Because I'm 53 years old and I've been running this operation since I was 26, and the men I delegate to are capable of doing what they're delegated to do." He turned from the window. "Or I thought they were." Marco absorbed that. The Enzo thing. How far does it go?" "I don't know yet. That's the part I'm working out." Raphael sat down behind his desk. "Go home, Marco. Sleep. I need you thinking clearly in the afternoon." "What about her, the professor?" "What about her?" "People are going to come at you through her, Pop. If they think—" "Nobody is coming at Evelyn," Raphael said, and the tone of it was so flat and so final that Marco, who had grown up hearing that tone in a variety of contexts, stopped talking. After he left, Raphael sat alone in the study as the gray morning came in through the windows, and he thought about Enzo Marchetti's hesitation and the white sedan nobody had logged. and the ledger books now sitting somewhere in Andrade's organization, coded and useless and yet deeply dangerous just as a symbol. Proof that someone had walked into a DeLuca property and taken something that wasn't theirs and walked out alive. He thought about the commission meeting scheduled for the following month, the annual gathering of family heads and their representatives that functioned as the underworld's legislature, and about which men would be in that room, and which of those men might have had a conversation with Andrade recently. He thought about Evelyn. He picked up his phone and called her. It rang 4 times. She slept well. She said it was the only physical advantage of growing older that she'd identified. And then her voice came clear and slightly rough with sleep. "Raphael, it's 6 in the morning. I know, I'm sorry." A pause. She was sitting up, probably, reaching for her glasses even though she didn't need them for a phone call. She'd told him she'd done this her whole life. It was a habitual gesture. Wearing glasses was like wearing armor, and she put it on when she needed to think. "What happened?" "Something at work. I'm all right, He stopped. There wasn't a clean way to say this. "I wanted to hear your voice." Another pause, shorter. "Are you at the house?" "Yes." "Come over at 8, she said. "I'll make breakfast and you can tell me what's wrong or not tell me what's wrong and we'll figure out which one you need." He said he would. He put the phone down and looked at the window where the morning was coming in slow and colorless, and he felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has been managing things alone for so long that the discovery of someone willing to sit beside the weight of it is its own kind of vertigo, terrifying and necessary at the same time, impossible to set down once you've let yourself feel it. He arrived at her apartment at 5 minutes past 8, and Herodotus met him at the door with his customary suspicion, sniffed his shoes, and departed. Evelyn was in the kitchen. There was coffee, and there were eggs, and there was the smell of toast, and the morning light coming through her kitchen window was the color of weak tea. And Raphael DeLuca, who had supervised the disposal of men who'd crossed him, and had walked through rooms where terrible things had happened, and had looked at worse things than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, stood in the doorway of her kitchen and felt, as he always felt in this particular room, that he was standing somewhere almost unbearably ordinary, and that the ordinariness of it was the point. She was wearing a sweater and reading glasses, and she'd pushed her silver hair back behind one ear, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Sit down. Tell me what happened or don't. There's orange juice." He sat down. He told her, not the specifics, never the specifics, but the shape of it. A betrayal inside the operation. Someone who'd been trusted. The fact that it connected outward to larger politics, he was still reading. She listened the way she always listened, which was completely. Not waiting for her turn to speak, not preparing a response, just receiving it. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in both hands. "The men talking about me," she said. Not a question. "Some of them. Marco." He looked at her. "How did you—" "He called me 3 weeks ago," she said. He was polite. He was very careful to be polite. He told me that he respected his father's autonomy, but that he was concerned about the perception of the relationship, and he asked me if I'd considered whether it was in my best interest to— She paused, and her mouth did something complicated that wasn't quite a smile. He was very indirect. He'd clearly practiced. Raphael was still. "You didn't tell me." "No." "Evelyn." "I didn't tell you because I handled it," she said simply. "I told him that I'd been navigating men who thought they knew better than I did since 1978, and that I was comfortable with the practice. I told him I wasn't going to let him use concern for my well-being as a vehicle for whatever his actual concern was, which was clearly about his own position. And I told him that if he had something to say to his father, he should say it to his father." Raphael looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was on her face. Outside, somewhere on the street, a bus was pulling away from a stop. "He didn't tell me he'd called," Raphael said. "I know. That's the part I thought was more important than whatever he said." She met his eyes. "The people around you, they're not just worried about optics, Raphael. They're measuring. They're taking stock of who you listen to, what you pay attention to, what makes you hesitate. An old woman in a faculty apartment, from the outside, that looks like a weakness." "You're not a weakness." "No," she said, "I'm not. But that's not what they see. And that's the problem you're actually dealing with. She set her coffee cup down. The warehouse, the books they took. That's not the main attack. That's reconnaissance. They're testing how fast you respond. They're watching what you prioritize. He looked at her. Sometimes he forgot, and then he remembered. She'd spent 40 years studying the mechanisms of power, institutional collapse, the way organizations decay from the inside out, the patterns that repeat across centuries and cultures, because human ambition doesn't change its fundamental grammar. She'd written 3 books on it. She'd taught it to hundreds of students and argued about it with colleagues who had prestigious chairs, and she'd read everything and forgotten nothing. "You think it's coordinated," he said. "I think it's been coordinated for longer than you know," she said. "And I think the coordination involves someone close enough to understand your operational patterns, but not close enough to know all of them, which puts it at a specific level." She stood up and went to the counter and refilled both their coffees. And then she came back and sat down and looked at him with the direct, unvarnished look that he'd come to understand as her version of intimacy. Not softness, but complete attention, the full weight of her intelligence directed at a problem that involved him. "There's something else," she said. "I've been looking at something for about 2 months. I haven't been sure how to bring it to you." "What have you been looking at?" She got up again. The kitchen was small enough that she moved through it in 3 steps in any direction, and opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and came back with a manila envelope, which she set on the table between them. He opened it. Inside were photocopies of documents, financial records on the surface, statements, routing entries, transfer confirmations. But she'd annotated them in her small, precise handwriting, drawing lines between entries, circling dates, marking patterns. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "From you," she said. "Or rather from things you showed me. The foundation documents, the ones you gave me when you were explaining how the legitimate side worked. Some of the routing numbers match something I'd seen in a different context. I spend a lot of time reading historical financial records. It's a professional habit. The way money moved in certain patronage networks in the late Republic looks—" She paused, as if deciding how precise to be. "It looks similar to the way money moves in these documents. Once I saw the pattern, I started paying more attention." Raphael looked at the papers. He turned them slowly. The annotated entries tracked a series of transfers over 14 months, not large individually, but cumulatively significant, and the routing path described a shape that was familiar to him in a deeply uncomfortable way. He knew these shell structures. He'd designed some of them, but some of these movements were ones he hadn't authorized, and the path they described led, if you followed it correctly, to somewhere he had not yet let himself name. "You knew it was dangerous to have this," he said. "Yes." "You kept it anyway." "I've been trying to figure out the right time to show you." She folded her hands on the table, and he noticed, not for the first time, the steadiness of them. No trembling, no fidgeting. 78, 68. The hands of a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that she was not going to be frightened of the things she had to do. "I think the right time is now." He looked at the papers for another minute. Then he looked at her. "These names," he said quietly, touching one of the circled entries. "You understand what this means?" "Yes." "You understand what these men would do if they knew you had this?" "Yes." "And you still— Evelyn, you should have told me." "I'm telling you now," she said, in the tone of someone who has made a decision and lived inside it for a while and is entirely at peace with having made it. "And now you have time to act before the commission meeting, which I think was the window they were counting on staying closed." He sat back. The coffee was going cold. Herodotus appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at Raphael with the judgment only cats can fully communicate, and departed again. "I need you to be safe," Raphael said. "I am safe." "I need you to let me put men—" "No," she said, simply and completely. "We've discussed this. I won't become the reason people die, Raphael. I won't have guards standing outside this building because of me. If the situation becomes one where that's necessary, then we'll renegotiate. Until then, the answer is no." "That is incredibly stubborn, yes, I know." She did smile now, finally, the real one, the one that had started this whole impossible thing. You can tell me why I'm wrong, and I'll consider it seriously. But I've been managing my own safety for 68 years, and I've done all right." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the city was waking up. Somewhere in that city, Andrade's people were reading ledger books they couldn't decode. Somewhere, Enzo Marchetti was sitting in his house not calling anyone, or was calling someone despite being told not to. Somewhere, the men who had coordinated the warehouse raid were waiting to see what Rafael De Luca did next, reading his response as a measure of everything they'd been calculating about him. And here, in this kitchen that smelled like toast and coffee, an old woman who studied the collapse of empires was showing him the map of his own. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "The documents, the pattern you saw, how long would it take you to write up what you found? All of it, the methodology, the connections, everything a forensic accountant would need to follow the trail." She looked at him steadily. "I've already written it up," she said. "I've had 2 months." He absorbed that. "You were already prepared," he said. "I'm a historian," she said. "I don't wait for events to become urgent before I document them. That's when the evidence disappears." He nodded slowly. He picked up the papers and folded them back into the envelope. He set it inside his jacket, against his chest, where he'd feel it there on the drive back. "I'll be back tonight," he said, "if that's all right." "It's all right," she said. He stood up. He looked at her one more time. The silver hair, the glasses, the complete and unfrightened eyes. And he thought about what Marco had said, about being different, slower, more willing to let things sit. He'd said it like an accusation, but Raphael thought now, standing in this kitchen with the shape of the betrayal taking form in his jacket pocket, that Marco had misread the phenomenon. He wasn't slower. He was being more careful about what he moved fast toward. He was separating the things that required the old instincts from the things that required something else, something he hadn't had before and had spent a year learning how to use. He walked to the door. He stopped. "Evelyn." "Yes." "The men who are planning this, the ones in the documents, when they find out I know, they'll move up their timeline." "I know," she said. "That means the commission meeting becomes the flashpoint, yes." She was looking at him across the kitchen. "I know, Raphael. I've been thinking about that since June." He nodded. He left. In the elevator going down, he held the envelope against his ribs and felt the paper through the fabric of his jacket, and thought about the names in Evelyn's careful handwriting, the circles around the entries, the lines drawn between transactions that his own people had never flagged because they were moving too fast to look at patterns, because they were too close to the operation to see its shape from outside. He thought about what was coming. He thought about the commission meeting, a month away, and the men who would be in that room and what they would be expecting from him. He stepped out of the elevator and walked through the lobby and out into the morning, where Carmine was already waiting with the car, already reading the angle of Raphael's shoulders, already composing the question he was going to ask. And Raphael got into the back seat and said, before Carmine could speak, "Pull up everything we have on the financial relationships between the commission families and the Andrade operation going back 18 months. Everything. And find out if Enzo Marchetti has made any calls in the last 3 hours." Carmine pulled into traffic. "And Carmine?" "Yeah. The commission meeting next month. I'm going to need to change the venue." Carmine glanced in the rearview mirror, reading the flat certainty in Raphael's face. He nodded once and said nothing, which was exactly what the situation called for. And the car moved through the morning city, and Rafael De Luca sat in the back seat with 68 years of a woman's intelligence pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat, and understood for the first time since the phone had rung at 2:47 in the morning exactly what the coming month was going to require of him, and what it was going to cost. He did not know yet, could not have known yet, that by the time the commission meeting arrived, the people plotting against him would already believe they had won. He did not know yet what it would look like when they found out they were wrong. But Evelyn knew. Evelyn had known for 2 months. And the only question left, the one that would answer everything, the one that was going to break open like a fault line in that meeting hall with every family boss in the country watching, was whether Rafael De Luca was willing to walk in and let them think they'd beaten him, long enough to let it all collapse around them. Enzo Marchetti made 4 calls in the 2 hours after Rafael sent him home. Carmine had the numbers on Raphael's desk by 10:30 that morning. Not the content, not yet, but the numbers themselves, the timestamps, the duration of each call. Raphael looked at them without touching the paper. The way a man looks at something he already knew was there but had been hoping, in some compartment of himself he hadn't fully acknowledged, was going to turn out to be something else. The first call was 7 minutes, the second was 2. The third was 11 minutes and went to a number registered to a shell company in Delaware that Carmine's contact at the carrier had flagged as interesting. The fourth call was 30 seconds, and then Enzo's phone had gone dark, turned off or destroyed, which meant he'd been told to go dark, which meant someone on the other end of one of those calls had that kind of authority over him. The Delaware number, Raphael said. Working on it, Carmine said. Give me until noon. You have until 11. Carmine left. Raphael sat at his desk and looked at the wall for a moment, then picked up his phone and called his consigliere. Sal Benedetti was 61 years old and had been Raphael's consigliere for 14 years. Before that, his father's lawyer. Before that, a young man from Calabria who'd come to this country with nothing and had turned a law degree and a preternatural ability to read rooms into one of the most valuable positions in the De Luca organization. He was careful, precise, and loyal in the specific way of men who had aligned their self-interest with yours so completely that distinguishing one from the other had become an academic exercise. Raphael had trusted him the way he trusted the weight of his own body, not consciously, just as a condition of movement. Sal answered on the second ring. I heard about the warehouse. I need you at the house. 1 hour. A pause. Not long. Half a breath. Of course. Raphael set the phone down. He looked at the Delaware number again. Then he looked at the envelope from Evelyn's kitchen, which he'd placed in the center of his desk, and he thought about the annotated pages inside it, and about the specific half-breath pause in Sal Benedetti's voice, and he felt something settle into place in his chest with the cold, ugly weight of a thing that has been true for longer than you knew and is only now becoming visible. Sal arrived in 58 minutes, which was 2 minutes early, which was unusual. He was dressed well, as always. Sal dressed like a man who believed that clothing was an argument, that presenting yourself with care was a form of making a case. He came into the study and sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited to sit, which was also their normal rhythm, and he looked at Raphael with the composed, attentive expression of a man ready to work a problem. Tell me about the warehouse, Raphael said. Andrade's move. Timed badly for us given the commission meeting next month. They'll read it as a weakness in your territory. Who told Andrade about the books? Sal's expression didn't change. That was the tell. Not a flinch, not a flicker, but the very absence of either, the controlled nothing of a man who had anticipated the question and was ready for it. We don't know that yet. I think we do, Raphael said. I think we've known for a while, and I've been slow to see it. Sal looked at him. In 14 years, they had sat across this desk for thousands of conversations, and Raphael had watched this man's face process grief and pressure, and bad news and good news, and the specific complicated information of violence, and he knew Sal's face the way you knew a road you'd driven until driving it became unconscious, which was why he could see now what he'd been not seeing for months, the micro-adjustment in the set of the jaw, the slight deliberateness of the breathing, the way Sal's hands, which were resting on his knees, were not quite as relaxed as they were positioned to appear. I'm going to show you something, Raphael said. He opened the envelope and laid the papers on the desk. Not all of them. 4 pages, the ones with the most clearly traced routing paths. He turned them so they faced Sal. He watched Sal look at them. The looking lasted 4 seconds. Then Sal said, Where did these come from? Answer the question the papers are asking. I don't know what question. Sal. Raphael's voice was quiet. Quieter than usual, which in his experience meant more than louder. You've known me for 22 years. You know when I'm asking because I don't know the answer, and when I'm asking because I need to hear you say it. Which one is this? The silence in the room was specific. Outside, a car passed on the street. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Sal looked at the papers for another moment, and then he looked at Raphael, and his face did something that Raphael had never seen it do in 22 years. It gave up. Not dramatically, just a subtle, exhausted release, like a muscle that had been held tight for so long that letting go felt like falling. "How long have you known?" Sal said. "I'm finding out right now," Raphael said. "So talk," Hutch said. It came out in pieces, the way these things always do. Not in a clean confession, but in the jagged, qualified language of a man who has been carrying something heavy and is discovering that setting it down doesn't feel the way he thought it would. Sal was not a panicking man. He talked the way he'd always talked, precisely, with the structure of a legal argument, which somehow made it worse. The conversations with Costa had started 8 months ago. Dominic Costa was the boss of the New England operation, a man 10 years younger than Raphael, who had spent the last several years consolidating territory with a speed that people had admired but not fully analyzed. Costa had come to Sal through an intermediary, careful, always careful, with a proposition framed as a concern. The concern was Raphael, specifically his judgment, specifically the changes in his judgment since the woman had entered the picture. "He didn't ask you to move against me," Raphael said. "Not directly, not at first. He asked me to observe, to report back on whether certain operational decisions were being influenced by Evelyn, by the relationship. Yes." "And you agreed?" Sal looked at the desk. "I agreed to listen. I told myself I was gathering information, that I was—" He stopped. "That's not a sufficient answer." "No," Raphael said. "It's not. I told myself it was about the family, that if you were genuinely, He stopped again. This was the first time Raphael had ever seen Sal Benedetti unable to finish a sentence. "There's money," he said finally. "Costa moved money through channels I had access to, the routing in those papers." He nodded at the documents. "He moved it as insurance, in case I needed to demonstrate loyalty to his side if things moved quickly." "He paid you?" "He positioned funds. He paid you," Raphael said again in the same quiet tone. Sal said nothing. Raphael looked at him for a long time. He thought about Sal at his wife's funeral, standing at the back of the church. Not the front, because Sal always understood his position relative to grief, always knew where to place himself in a room. Standing there in the rain afterward with his hat in his hand. He thought about the 100 decisions they'd made together, and the dozens of times Sal's counsel had been exactly right, and the way that rightness had become so reliable that he'd stopped fully examining it, the way you stop examining the floor when you're certain of its solidity. "The Delaware shell," Raphael said. "That's where Enzo's call went." "Enzo has been Costa's for longer than me," Sal said. "I didn't bring Enzo in. I want you to know that." "I need to know who else." Sal folded his hands. "Fabri. Probably, 2 of the captains in the East Side operation. I don't know the full shape of it. I was kept compartmentalized. Deliberately. Yes, Costa is careful." Raphael looked at the papers on the desk. 68 years old, a retired history professor, a woman with a cat named after a Greek historian, had looked at these documents and seen what none of the professionals around him had caught, or, he understood now, had chosen not to catch. "Get out of my house," he said. Sal stood up. He looked at Raphael with the expression of a man looking at something he's broken and cannot fix, which was an accurate accounting of the situation. He started toward the door. "Sal," he stopped. "Don't go to Costa. Don't go anywhere except the house on Prescott. Stay there. If you leave Prescott or make contact with anyone in Costa's network, I will know within the hour." Sal nodded. He left. Raphael sat alone in the study, and outside the morning was fully arrived now, the sun hard and flat through the windows, and he picked up the papers and looked at Evelyn's handwriting in the margins. The neat small annotations, the circles, the lines drawn between entries that described the architecture of his betrayal with the same methodical clarity she'd probably applied to the financial records of the Roman Senate, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not rage exactly, something colder and more fundamental than either. The feeling of standing at the edge of something that was going to require him to be a specific kind of person, and knowing that being that person was going to cost something he didn't want to pay. Marco came at 2 in the afternoon, and he came with Richie Fabri. This told Raphael something important before either of them spoke. Fabri was 55, thick through the shoulders, a man who ran the docks operation with a competence that had always been real and that Raphael had valued genuinely. He had a wife and 3 daughters and a house in Westlake and a handshake that he used like a statement of character. He sat down in the study with the careful posture of a man trying to take up less space than his actual dimensions, which was a tell Raphael recognized. The physical vocabulary of someone who felt guilty about something or was about to ask for something they knew they shouldn't be asking for. Marco sat beside him. Marco wasn't trying to take up less space. Marco was sitting the way he always sat, forward-leaning, elbows on knees, with the restless forward energy of a young man who had decided something and wanted to get past the part where he had to say it. "Talk," Raphael said. Marco glanced at Fabri. Fabri looked at the floor for a moment, then at Raphael. "I want you to hear me out." "I'm listening." "The commission meeting," Fabri said. "The situation is—" He paused. "Don Raphael, there are 4 family heads who've been in private conversation with Costa over the past 6 months. Not about moving against you. About the perception problem. About what it means for business if the head of this family is seen as— Say it." Fabri looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who's rehearsed a thing and found the rehearsed version suddenly inadequate in the actual room. "Compromised. In his judgment. Because of a personal relationship." Raphael looked at his son. "You brought Richie here." "I asked him to come," Marco said, "because he's been saying the same thing I've been saying for 6 months, and I thought maybe you'd hear it from him if you wouldn't hear it from me." "And what exactly have you been saying?" "That you need to end it." Marco said it straight, which Raphael gave him credit for. He didn't dress it up. "The thing with the professor. You need to end it, and you need to do it in a way people can see before the commission meeting, because Costa is going to make it the centerpiece of whatever he's building. And if you walk into that room still attached to her, every man in there is going to have already decided the answer to the question Costa is asking." Raphael looked at his son for a long moment. Marco held the look without flinching, which was also something Raphael gave him credit for. "What question is that?" Raphael said. "Whether you're still the right man." The room was quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something persistent in the oak trees. "Richie," Raphael said, "are you with Costa?" Fabri's face went through something complicated. "I've had conversations. I haven't committed to anything." "That's a yes," Raphael said. "Don Raphael, I'm sitting here telling you this to your face, which I wouldn't be doing if— You're telling me because Marco convinced you that if things break the way he thinks they're going to break, it's better for you to be on record as having warned me. That's not loyalty, Richie. That's hedging." He paused. "I've always known the difference. I just let it go because your work on the docks was good, but now I'm paying attention more carefully." Fabri said nothing. "Go home," Raphael said. "Same instruction I'm giving everyone today. Go home and don't make calls." Fabri stood up, and the look on his face was the look of a man who'd come in believing he had options and was leaving understanding he had fewer of them. He left without saying anything else, which was the right call. Marco didn't move. "You too," Raphael said. "I'm not leaving," Marco said. "I'm your son. I'm telling you something you don't want to hear because nobody else around here has the stomach to say it directly. You want to be angry at me for that, fine, but I'm not angry at you," Raphael said. That stopped him. He looked at his father with the slightly off-balance expression of a man who'd prepared for a fight and found the other person sitting down. "I'm not angry," Raphael said again. "You're right that people around you have been saying these things, and you're right that you're one of the few saying them to my face instead of to someone else. I appreciate the directness." He paused. "But you're wrong about the answer." "Pop, ending it doesn't fix anything. It tells Costa that the pressure worked. It tells every man in that commission room that you can move Rafael De Luca by applying social pressure through his family. It doesn't make me look strong, Marco. It makes me look like a man who can be maneuvered. and a man who can be maneuvered once can be maneuvered again. Marco was quiet. Raphael could see him working through it, the logic of it, fighting against it because some part of him still believed the simple version of the problem, that the woman was the problem, and removing the woman removed the problem. She found something, Raphael said. He said it without elaborating, and he watched Marco's face. What do you mean she found something? I mean that in the time the men around me have been watching me and measuring me and reporting back to Dominic Costa, the woman they've been calling my weakness was sitting in her apartment reading financial documents and mapping every transfer, every shell account, every routing number Costa used to buy the people he bought. She built the case. He paused. She built it 2 months ago, and she's been waiting for the right moment to give it to me. Marco stared at him. She's not the liability, Marco. She's the reason we're not already finished. The silence this time was different from the previous silences. It had a specific texture, the silence of a young man recalibrating. How much does she know? Marco said finally. Everything she needs to know, nothing that can hurt her. If Costa finds out she has the documents, Costa doesn't find out, Raphael said, because everyone who knows about the documents is either me, you right now, or Sal Benedetti, who is currently at his house on Prescott, not calling anyone. He looked at his son steadily. That's why I'm telling you, because I need to know you're inside this, not outside it, not hedging, not having conversations with people who are having conversations with Costa. Inside. Marco looked at his father. He had his mother's eyes, which right now held the complicated calculation of a young man choosing between the version of the world he'd been building in his head and the version sitting across the desk from him. I called her, Marco said, 3 weeks ago. I called the professor. I told her, I know, Raphael said. Marco absorbed that. She told you. She tells me things that matter, Raphael said. That's the point. Another silence. Then Marco said, What do you need me to do? By evening, Raphael had the full picture, or close enough to it. Costa had been building for 11 months. He had Enzo, Fabri, who had been more committed than he'd presented, 2 captains from the east side, and through Sal, access to enough operational intelligence to know the timing of the commission meeting and the likely agenda. The plan, as Raphael had assembled it from Sal's careful, stripped-down accounting, was designed around a specific sequence: the warehouse raid as a public demonstration of weakness, a coordinated presentation to the commission by 4 compliant family heads challenging Raphael's leadership, and a proposed vote on succession. Marco, not Costa himself, because Costa was smart enough to know that a New England boss openly seizing a Chicago family would generate more resistance than the same outcome dressed as an internal family choice. Marco as the front, Costa as the architect, the commission as the instrument. It was clean, it was patient. It had been patient for nearly a year, and it would have worked if Evelyn Brooks hadn't recognized a pattern in some financial records that reminded her of something she'd read in a history book about the fall of the Roman Republic, and quietly started pulling threads. Raphael drove to her apartment at 9 that night. The city was warm and the streets were full of ordinary people doing ordinary things, and he sat in the back of the car watching them with the feeling of a man behind glass. She opened the door before he knocked. She'd heard the elevator, she said. She always heard the elevator. And she looked at him once, the careful, comprehensive look, and said, Come in. Tell me. He told her all of it. Sal, Fabri, Costa's architecture, the timeline. He told her more than he'd ever told her before, because the situation had moved past the point where calibrated disclosure was a useful strategy, and because she had already earned it. She listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she got up and went to her desk, a large old wooden desk buried under papers and books, the kind of desk that looked like it had been a site of serious work for decades, and came back with another envelope, thicker than the first one. The rest, she said, I've been building the timeline for 2 months, everything Costa moved, every contact I could trace, the names I could verify, and the ones I could only infer. He took it. He looked at her. Evelyn, if they know you have this, they don't know, she said, and they won't know. unless something goes wrong at the commission meeting. She sat down across from him, straight-backed in the way she always sat, hands folded, Herodotus appearing at her ankle and receiving no acknowledgement because he'd arrived at an inconvenient moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let them think they've won," Raphael said, "between now and the meeting. I'm going to let Costa believe his timeline is intact. I'm going to—" He paused. "I'm going to let the people around me believe that the pressure is working, that I'm withdrawing, that I'm reconsidering." She looked at him for a long moment. "You mean you're going to behave as though you're ending things with me?" "In appearance, publicly, for the next 3 weeks." She was quiet. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know you do." Her voice was even, not hurt. She wasn't a woman who performed hurt, but something in it was carefully measured, the way you measure something that matters. "If you go dark for 3 weeks, people will draw conclusions. My former colleagues, the neighbors who've seen your car. It won't be invisible." "No," he said, "it won't. And you're asking me to accept that." "I'm asking you to accept it for 3 weeks, and then—" He stopped. "And then I'm going to walk into that commission meeting and I'm going to show every man in that room exactly what happened. I'm going to show them the documents, the routing, the names. I'm going to show them that Costa spent 11 months building a conspiracy against a sitting family head using the family's own consigliere as an inside man. And I'm going to do it with your name attached to the evidence because you're the one who found it. And because attaching your name to it is the only way to make certain they understand that the woman they called my weakness is the reason they're all still in business instead of in the middle of a war." Evelyn looked at him steadily. The lamp on her desk made a warm circle in the dim room. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifferent energy. "There's a risk," she said. "If someone moves before the meeting, I know. If Costa finds out the evidence exists before the meeting, I know." He looked at her. "That's why I need you to let me put someone in the building, not at the door, not visible, but in the building. Someone in the lobby who knows your face. Will you give me that?" She considered it. He watched her consider it, the specific working through of a woman who had spent her whole life managing the line between autonomy and practicality, who had bent on this question exactly once in their entire relationship, and was measuring whether this moment was worth another bend. "One person," she said, "in the lobby. Not my floor." "One person in the lobby," he said. "That's all I need." She nodded once. Then she looked at him, the full, undeflected look, and said, 3 weeks? Then you walk into that room and you finish it." 3 weeks, he said. He stood to go. He was at the door when she said his name. "Raphael." He turned. She was looking at him from across the room, silver-haired, straight-backed, entirely unafraid, holding the evidence that was going to decide the next chapter of everything. "Don't be slow," she said. "When the time comes, don't hesitate because you're trying to be careful. The moment will be short, and you'll know it when you see it." He looked at her for a moment, and something moved through him that had no clean name, not love exactly, though it was that too, but something more specific, the particular feeling of being seen by someone who sees accurately and doesn't flinch and doesn't lie about what they're looking at. "I know," he said. He left. In the car going home, Carmine said nothing, and Raphael said nothing, and the city went past in its nighttime colors. And somewhere across the city, Dominic Costa was in his hotel suite reviewing his timeline and believing it was intact, and Sal Benedetti was sitting in his house on Prescott Street looking at a phone he'd been told not to use. And Marco De Luca was at his own apartment working through a recalibration of everything he thought he'd understood about his father, and Enzo Marchetti had his phone turned off and was somewhere doing the math on his own survival. And in an apartment building on the north side, a woman was sitting at her wooden desk with her cat on her lap, and she was looking at the calendar, and she was counting days. 22 days to the commission meeting, 22 days to the room where everything was going to break open. Raphael looked out the window at the city and felt the weight of what was coming pressed down on him, the weight of the commitment, of the performance he was going to have to sustain for 3 weeks, while Costa finished building his trap, while the men around him watched and calculated and believed they were watching a man bend. He didn't know yet, couldn't have known yet, that Bending was going to look from the inside of that commission room like something else entirely. He didn't know yet that Costa had one more move he hadn't accounted for. One move that was going to Costa's one move that Raphael hadn't accounted for was Marco. Not Marco as a conspirator. Raphael had been wrong about that, and the wrongness of it was going to cost him in ways he was still calculating when the car pulled into the Aldermere Drive gate at 11:15 on the night of the commission meeting, 18 days earlier than scheduled, because Costa had moved the timeline and nobody had told Raphael until it was already moving. It started with a phone call at 6 in the morning, 19 days before the original meeting date, from a number Raphael didn't recognize. He answered it because he always answered numbers he didn't recognize. Unknown numbers were either wrong numbers or important ones, and you learned which by picking up. The voice on the other end was a woman's, calm, professional, the flat Midwestern affect of someone who had learned to deliver information without editorializing. She said her name was Agent Diana Reyes, and she was with the Organized Crime Division of the FBI Field Office, and she said she was calling because she believed Rafael DeLuca's life was in imminent danger, and she had information she believed he'd want to hear before 8 o'clock that morning. Rafael said, "How did you get this number?" She said, "Sal Benedetti gave it to us 40 minutes ago." He met her at a diner on Ashworth Avenue, a place that opened at 5:30 and served the overnight shift workers from the rail yard 2 blocks over, not a place anyone would expect to find him, which was the point. He came alone, which Carmine argued against for the entire drive, and which Raphael insisted upon because a federal agent in a public diner was not an ambush, and arriving with security would tell her more about his state of mind than he wanted her to know. She was already there, in a booth at the back, a woman in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back and the specific watchful stillness of someone who spent their professional life reading rooms. She had coffee, and she hadn't ordered food, and she looked at him when he came in with the expression of someone who'd been briefed extensively and was now revising against the actual person. He sat down. A waitress appeared. He ordered coffee, nothing else. "Sal came to you," he said. "He came to the field office at 4:40 this morning," Reyes said. "He asked for a proffer agreement. He's been talking for 2 hours." Raphael looked at his coffee when it arrived. He turned the cup once on the saucer. "What did he give you?" "A lot," she said, "most of which isn't my immediate problem this morning. My immediate problem is that Dominic Costa moved the commission meeting to tonight. Not next month, tonight. A private venue, not the one in your calendar. And Sal's assessment, which I'm inclined to believe, is that the plan for tonight is not a vote." She paused. "It's an execution. Yours. And it's built around something that went wrong in Costa's timeline that he's decided to fix directly." Raphael kept his face arranged. "What went wrong?" Reyes looked at him for a moment. "Someone in your circle, not Sal, someone else, told Costa that you have documentary evidence of his financial movements, the shell accounts, the routing. Costa believes you're planning to use it at the commission meeting to expose him. He's not wrong." She paused again. "He moved the meeting because he needs you in that room before you can use it. He needs you dead before the evidence surfaces." Raphael sat still. The diner around him was full of its ordinary morning sounds, the clink of cutlery, the low voices of rail workers, the hiss of the coffee machine. Somebody laughed at the counter. The sound of it was very far away. "Who told him about the evidence?" Raphael said. Reyes looked at him with the expression of someone about to say a thing they know will land badly. "We believe it was your son." The drive back took 23 minutes, and Raphael did not speak, and Carmine did not speak, and the city went past like something happening to someone else. He didn't believe it. That was the first reaction, the flat, instinctive refusal that has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the specific architecture of what you need to be true. Marco had been in the room. Marco had been told about the documents. Marco had been the only person besides Raphael and Evelyn who knew what Evelyn had built. He told Marco because he needed Marco inside. Because Marco was his son, and that should have meant something categorical and absolute, the way certain things are supposed to mean categorical and absolute things, and don't. And the discovery that they don't is one of the specific varieties of damage that doesn't heal the way other damage heals. He called Marco from the car. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He called again. 6 rings, voicemail. "Carmine," he said. "Already on it." Marco's apartment was empty. His car was gone from the garage. His phone was either off or dead, and the 2 men Carmine sent to the apartment building said the super hadn't seen him since the previous evening and that he'd left with a bag. A bag. Raphael sat in the back of the car outside Marco's empty building and felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature but from understanding. The slow, devastating understanding of a betrayal that has its own logic, that you can follow back through time and find the points where it could have gone differently and didn't. Marco had called Evelyn 3 weeks ago to pressure her. Marco had been in private conversations with people who were in private conversations with Costa. Marco had come to the house with Fabri, had brought Fabri, had organized that meeting, and then Raphael had told him everything, had told him about the documents, about the evidence, about the plan to walk into the commission meeting and expose Costa in front of every family head in the country. He had handed his son the knife and then turned around. He called Evelyn. It rang 3 times, longer than usual, and when she picked up, her voice had the texture of someone who'd been awake for a while and had been waiting. "I know," she said, before he could speak. "What do you know?" "Someone called the building at 5 this morning, asked for my unit by number. The lobby man, your man, he flagged it and called me." A pause. "I moved." Raphael went very still. "Where are you?" "Somewhere safe. I'm not going to tell you on the phone." "Evelyn, I've been careful my whole life," she said, and her voice was steady in the specific way of someone who has made a decision and is living inside it. "I know what the call means. I'm not at the apartment. The documents are with me. I'm fine." He breathed. "I need to find you." "You need to handle tonight first," she said. "Then you find me. In that order." "Evelyn, Costa is—" "I heard you. Tonight. Handle tonight." A beat. "Don't let what Marco did make you stupid. That's what Costa is counting on. He moved the timeline because he wanted you emotional and reactive. Don't give him that." He said nothing for a moment. The cold was still there in his chest, the Marco-shaped hole in everything he thought was solid. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a wound. Present, constant, requiring management. "I'll call you after," he said. "I'll be here," she said. Odd. The venue was a private dining room on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that a holding company with no obvious connection to anything had rented for the evening. Raphael knew the building, had walked past it 100 times, had probably shaken hands with the man who owned the holding company at some civic event without knowing the connection. That was how these things worked. Everything hiding inside everything else, layers of ordinary life over the infrastructure of something else entirely. He had 6 hours. He spent 3 of them with Carmine and 2 men he trusted at the level of absolute certainty, a level that had contracted significantly in the past 12 hours, but still existed because without it, there was nothing to operate from. He went through what Reyes had told him, what Sal had given the FBI, what the documents showed, and what Costa was expecting to walk into tonight. He went through who would be in that room and what each of them wanted, and which of those wants could be redirected and which were fixed. The plan he'd been building for 3 weeks, the patient, architecture-dependent plan that relied on walking into the meeting at the appointed time with the evidence prepared and the room already primed to hear it, was gone. Costa had destroyed it by moving the meeting, by getting there first, by ensuring that Raphael would walk into a room that had already been arranged against him. So he wasn't going to use that plan. He was going to walk into a room arranged against him and do something Costa hadn't planned for, because Costa had spent 11 months planning for the Raphael De Luca he thought he understood. The one who was slower now, more deliberate, more cautious, the one who'd been softened by the woman. And he hadn't accounted for the possibility that the slowness wasn't softness, that the deliberateness wasn't hesitation, that the woman hadn't made him weaker, but had given him access to an entirely different kind of intelligence than the kind Costa had been measuring. He called Agent Reyes at noon. "The proffer," he said. "What does Sal want?" "Immunity on the older material. He'll give you Costa, the full network, the financial structure. He says he has enough to put Costa away for—" "Tell him he has a deal," Raphael said. "But I need something from you first." A pause. "Mr. De Luca, I'm not in the business of... I'm not asking you to do anything illegal, he said. I'm asking you to be at a specific address at 9 o'clock tonight with enough people to make an arrest. I'm going to give you Costa in that room. On the record, in front of witnesses, with the documentary evidence to support it. But I need to be the one who puts him there. A pause. Can you do that? Reyes was quiet for a moment. You understand that what you're describing, I understand what I'm describing, puts you in a room with people who intend to kill you. Yes. Another silence. Longer this time. He could hear her breathing and the ambient sound of wherever she was. An office, probably. The particular quality of fluorescent-lit federal space. 9 o'clock, she said finally. What's the address? He gave it to her. He arrived at the building at 8:40, which was 20 minutes before the meeting was called, which was intentional. Walking in early changed the room. Walking in early meant you'd chosen the ground, even when someone else had set the trap. There were 4 men he didn't know in the lobby, positioned with the specific casual-looking non-casualness of men who are positioned rather than present. One of them made eye contact with him for half a second too long and then looked away, and Raphael walked past all 4 of them to the elevator without stopping, because stopping would have told them something, and he had no more information to give away tonight. The room on the 14th floor held 9 men. He knew 8 of them. The 9th was a man he'd never seen, young, 30 at most, standing near the window with the contained stillness of someone whose job tonight was not to talk. Dominic Costa was at the head of the table. He was 53, 10 years younger than Raphael, with the broad-shouldered physical confidence of a man who'd never quite had to prove himself in the specific ways that left marks. He had a face that was handsome in an architectural way, good structure, little expression, and dark eyes that were doing the calculation right now, reading Raphael's arrival, the timing of it, the absence of carmine, the particular set of Raphael's shoulders. Whatever he was calculating, he kept it off his face. He stood up. Raphael! He gestured at the chair across the table. Sit down. There are things we need to discuss. Raphael looked around the room. The 8 men he knew, 3 family heads, 2 captains, Costa's own consigliere, a man from the New York operation whose presence was the most interesting thing in the room because it meant Costa had gotten to New York, and Fabry, who was looking at the table with the expression of a man who had fully committed to a side and was now sitting with the specific discomfort of that commitment in the presence of the man he'd committed against. No Marco. That absence was its own data point. Raphael sat down. Costa sat down. He folded his hands on the table with the measured deliberateness of a man who'd rehearsed this opening. There's a concern, he said, among the families, about leadership of the DeLuca operation, about judgment, about whether certain personal considerations have affected the operational clarity of... Dominic, Raphael said. Costa stopped. I know about the warehouse. I know about Sal. I know about the shell accounts and the routing and the 14 months you spent buying my people. He paused. I also know about tonight, what it was supposed to be. He let that sit for a moment. So let's skip the part where you frame this as a leadership concern and talk about what it actually is. The room changed temperature. Not visibly. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, but something shifted in the quality of the attention. The way attention shifts when people in a room realize the script they were handed is no longer the script being performed. Costa's face did something careful. You're making an accusation. I'm making a statement, Raphael said. The accusation is in the documents. He reached into his jacket and laid the envelope on the table. Not all of it. A selection, the cleanest pages, the ones where the routing numbers were most legible and the connections most direct. He laid them in the center of the table, where everyone could see them. Costa looked at the papers. His expression was controlled, but Raphael had spent 30 years reading controlled expressions, and he could see the thing underneath it, the rapid recalculation, the rerouting of a plan that had just encountered an obstacle it hadn't modeled. Those documents don't prove. They prove you moved money through 4 shell accounts to buy my consigliere, my operations head, 2 of my captains, and Richie Fabry, Raphael said. They prove you funded a warehouse raid on my property to manufacture a public demonstration of weakness in my organization. And they prove that you've been planning to use this meeting. He looked around the table, slowly at each face, not as a leadership review, but as a conclusion. The young man by the window moved, a very small movement, a shift of weight, a repositioning. But Raphael had seen it before the man made it, had been watching for it since he sat down, and he said, without raising his voice or changing his tone at all, "The man at the window, tell him to stay where he is." Costa's jaw tightened. He didn't look at the man by the window. He kept his eyes on Raphael. "You're in a room full of people who have questions about your leadership. I'm in a room full of people who have questions about yours," Raphael said, "because the documents also show the New York routing." He looked at the man from New York, who had not moved, but whose face had gone the specific gray of a man who has just understood something he can't undo. "You want to tell them what that routing shows, or should I?" The New York man said nothing. "Costa spent 8 months negotiating to bring New York into this," Raphael said to the room, "not because he needed their firepower, because he needed the legitimacy. A vote supported by New York carries weight the other families respect, but New York's support costs something. It costs territory. Specifically, it cost the Harlem distribution network, which Costa agreed to cede to the New York operation as payment." He paused. "Which means that if this vote had happened tonight the way Costa planned it, every man in this room would have been operating under a commission decision that was bought. And you wouldn't have known it for another 6 months, when the New York operation started moving into territory that used to belong to your people." The temperature dropped another degree. Costa was very still now, and the stillness was different from the controlled stillness of before. It was the stillness of something that has been cornered and is deciding whether the decision it made 11 months ago was worth what it's going to cost in the next 5 minutes. "You brought manufactured documents to a commission meeting," Costa said, and his voice was flat and hard, the last instrument he had available. "And you're making accusations you can't substantiate in front of—" "I can substantiate everything in this room," Raphael said, "because the man who built the financial trail is Sal Benedetti, who was your inside man for 8 months, and who has been talking to the FBI for the past 14 hours. He watched Costa's face, watched the specific moment of impact. Sal's proffer includes dates, names, amounts, and recorded conversations, which means that the evidence I'm showing you right now has a federal corroboration that makes it the most thoroughly documented case of commission corruption in the past 20 years. He let that settle. You planned tonight as an execution. Instead, you built the government's case for them." The room was completely silent, the kind of silence that has a density to it, that sits on the chest. Costa looked at the papers. He looked at Raphael. He looked at the man from New York, who was looking at the table. He looked at Fabri, who was looking at his hands. He looked at the young man by the window, who had gone very still in the way of a man who is rapidly reassessing whether his instructions for the evening are still operative. And then Costa did the thing that Raphael had been waiting for, the thing that the past 3 weeks of patient performance had been designed to produce. He reached inside his jacket. He got his hand on the weapon. He did not get it out. The door opened. It opened the way federal doors open, fast, certain, with the specific weight of authority that comes from a warrant and backup, and the absolute confidence of people who have been waiting in a stairwell for the right moment. Agent Reyes came in first, which Raphael had not expected, and which told him something about her that he filed away. Behind her were 8 agents, and behind them were 2 more at the door, and the room went from the charged silence of a moment about to break into the specific controlled chaos of an arrest operation that knows exactly who it's looking for. Costa's hand was still inside his jacket. He looked at Reyes. He looked at Raphael. And in his eyes, in the fraction of a second before the professional mask came down completely, Raphael saw the moment of understanding. Not just that the plan had failed, but how it had failed. The specific architecture of it, the patience it had required, the months of apparent decline that had been something else entirely. "Dominic Costa," Reyes said, "you are under arrest." Costa took his hand out of his jacket. Empty. He was smart to the end. There were witnesses, there were cameras Reyes's team had positioned on the way in, and a dead man in a federal arrest was a different kind of problem than a live one. He put both hands on the table, flat, and he looked at Raphael one more time across the surface of the documents that had built the case against him. "The woman," he said. His voice was very quiet, meant only for Raphael. "She built this." "Yes," Raphael said. Costa said nothing else. The agents moved in, and it was procedural after that. The reading of rights, the cuffing, the careful professional management of 8 other men in the room who were being sorted into categories of culpability with a speed that suggested Reyes had done her homework on everyone who'd been invited tonight, not just Costa. Fabry was crying. Raphael noticed this without feeling much about it. Richie Fabry, who had a wife and 3 daughters and a house in Westlake and a handshake he used like a character statement, was sitting at the table with his hands shaking and tears running down his face, and it was the most human thing in the room and also one of the saddest. Raphael stood up. An agent moved toward him and Reyes said quietly, "He's not part of this," and the agent stepped back. Raphael walked to the window. The city was below him, lit and alive and indifferent, and he stood there for a moment with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding something at enormous cost for a long time and has just put it down and is discovering that the putting down doesn't feel like relief exactly. Not yet. It feels like the moment after a very loud noise, when the silence is so complete it registers as its own kind of pressure. He took out his phone. He called the number Evelyn had called him from that morning. It rang twice. "It's done?" she said. "It's done," he said. A pause. He could hear her breathing. Steady, unremarkable. The breathing of a woman who had been afraid in the right proportions and was now releasing it at the right rate. "Are you all right?" He thought about Marco, the bag, the empty apartment, the 6 rings going to voicemail, the specific shape of that absence and everything that had happened tonight, the way it sat differently from the Costa betrayal, which had been a professional wound, a strategic wound, a wound with clean edges. The Marco wound was different. The Marco wound had ragged edges and no clear bottom, and was going to require a different kind of accounting than anything he'd done in this room tonight. "I'll tell you when I see you," he said. "Where are you?" She told him. He memorized the address. He put the phone in his pocket and turned from the window and walked out of the room, past the agents and the arrested men and Fabry's shaking hands, and the young man from the window who was sitting on the floor looking stunned, past all of it, to the elevator and down and out into the night where Carmine was waiting at the curb with the engine running, having received the text that meant it was over, having known without being told which entrance Raphael would use. "The professor?" Carmine said. "Take me to her," Raphael said. The car moved into the city. Raphael looked out the window and felt the cold of the Marco-shaped hole and thought about a conversation he was going to have. A conversation with no good version of itself. A conversation that was going to require him to be a specific kind of father in addition to everything else he'd been required to be tonight. He thought about what Evelyn had said in her kitchen the morning after the warehouse raid. The strong do what they can. Thucydides was describing what happens in the absence of other options. He was not prescribing it. He was going to have to find Marco. He was going to have to sit across from his son and look at him the way he'd looked at Sal, and the way he'd looked at Costa, and understand how much of it was choice, and how much was the particular damage of growing up inside the thing Raphael had built. The damage he'd protected Dante from, and hadn't protected Marco from. The damage that maybe made certain choices feel like logic instead of betrayal. He didn't know yet if that understanding was going to change anything. He didn't know yet what Marco had been told or promised, or what version of events Costa had given him that made handing over his father's evidence feel like the right move. He didn't know yet if Marco had understood what tonight was supposed to be, what the room on the 14th floor was actually for. The car turned north. The city moved around him. And in a building somewhere ahead, a 68-year-old retired history professor was sitting with the documents that had broken a conspiracy open, and a cat that distrusted strangers, and the calm of a woman who had known for weeks what kind of night this was going to be and had prepared for it. The address Evelyn gave him was a hotel on the north side. Not a luxury hotel, not the kind of place anyone would look for her. A mid-range business traveler place with a parking structure attached and an entrance off the side street that she'd probably chosen for exactly that reason. Room 408. She answered the door before he knocked, which meant she'd heard the elevator again. and she looked at him once, the full inventory look, checking for damage, and stepped back to let him in. The room was small and lit by the desk lamp and the television she'd muted. Her bag was on the chair, open, and beside it was the thick envelope of documents and a yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting. Herodotus was not present, which meant she'd left him with the neighbor she trusted, which meant she'd planned the departure more than a few hours in advance. She'd known this was coming before he did. He sat on the edge of the bed. She sat in the desk chair, turned to face him, and waited. "Marco," he said. "Tell me." He told her. Not everything at once. It came out in pieces, the way things come out when you're still assembling them while you speak, when the full shape of it isn't yet solid. The empty apartment, the bag, the phone going to voicemail, what Reyes had said in the diner, the way he'd laid the documents on the table in that 14th floor room and seen Costa's face do the calculation of a man discovering that the move he'd counted on, the leak, the compromised intelligence, had been turned against him instead of for him. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Did Marco know what tonight was supposed to be?" "I don't know." "That matters," she said. Whether he understood the room was an execution or whether Costa told him something else, that changes what it means. It doesn't change that he gave Costa the information. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "But you're going to have to find him and hear it from him before you decide what it means for the two of you. You know that." He did know it. He also knew that knowing it and doing it were separated by a distance that right now felt uncrossable. Not because he was unwilling, but because the Marco-shaped wound was still too raw to approach directly, still too hot to touch with the part of himself that made decisions instead of just feeling things. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He looked at her. The desk lamp made the room warm in a way that was specific to small rooms in the middle of the night, the particular warmth of enclosed space and low light that has nothing to do with temperature. "You knew before I called," he said. "This morning. You were already packed." "I was packed 3 days ago," she said, "when I realized the timeline might move." She paused. "I've been reading about Dominic Costa for 2 months. He's not a patient man by nature. The patience in this plan was structural. He needed the commission meeting as his vehicle, and the meeting had a fixed date. But if he found out the evidence existed, he wouldn't wait. He'd accelerate." She looked at the legal pad on the desk. "I calculated that if Marco was the leak, Costa would move within 72 hours of learning about the documents. That put the window at last night or tonight." Raphael looked at her. "You were running the scenario." "I'm a historian," she said. "I run scenarios. It's what I do." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to act differently. I needed you to be exactly as prepared as you were, not more, not less. If I told you I thought Marco was the leak 2 weeks ago, you would have confronted him, and then everything would have collapsed." He absorbed that. The patience of it. The specific discipline of knowing something and choosing not to act on it because the timing wasn't right, sitting with that knowledge for 2 weeks while it pressed against you. "That cost you something," he said. "Yes," she said, simply. He reached across and took her hand. She let him, which was not nothing. Evelyn was not a woman who received comfort automatically. She had to decide to let it in. And the fact that she was letting it in told him something about the 2 weeks she'd just described. They sat like that for a while. Outside, the city made its nighttime sounds. Somewhere in it, Marco was wherever he was with his bag and his phone turned off, sitting with what he'd done or not yet fully understanding what he'd done, and Raphael was going to have to find out which. What? He left the hotel at 2 in the morning. He did not sleep. By 7, he had Marco's location, a motel in Orland Park, southwest of the city, the kind of place you went when you needed to be off the grid but hadn't planned far enough ahead to be truly invisible. Carmine had found the car registration through a cousin who worked for the county. It was that easy, which meant Marco hadn't been thinking clearly when he ran, which meant something. He drove out himself. Just him and Carmine, no additional security, because what was about to happen in that motel room was not something he wanted witnessed. Marco answered the door on the 3rd knock. He was in the same clothes as the night before, which meant he hadn't slept either. His face had the specific gray-white of someone who'd been sitting in a room alone with something terrible for 8 hours and hadn't found a way to set it down. He looked at his father in the doorway, and he didn't run, didn't speak, just stepped back and let him in. The room was small, one chair, one bed, a television off, a takeout bag on the nightstand that hadn't been opened. Marco sat on the edge of the bed. Raphael stood. "Talk," Raphael said. Marco looked at the floor. He pressed his hands between his knees the way he'd done as a child when he'd broken something and was deciding whether to admit it. "Costa told me—" He stopped. Started again. "Costa told me the meeting was a vote, a formal challenge to your leadership. He told me it was going to happen whether I was part of it or not, and that if I was part of it, if I helped position it, I'd be the natural successor. He said nobody was going to get hurt, that you'd be asked to step down, that it would be done with enough respect that you could—" He stopped again. "That I could what?" Raphael said. "That you could retire. That's what he said. That the family would be taken care of, that you'd be protected." The word landed in the room with its full weight. Protected. A word Costa had used knowing exactly what it would mean to a son who'd grown up afraid of what his father's life might eventually cost him, knowing the specific lever it would work in a young man who loved his father and was also terrified of everything his father represented. "And the documents," Raphael said. "When I told you about the documents." Marco's jaw tightened. Costa said if you walked into the commission meeting with evidence against him, it would start a war, that people would die, that it was better— He said it was better for everyone if the transition happened without— He stopped. "I didn't know it was going to be—" He stopped again, and this time he didn't start again. Raphael looked at his son, 29 years old, sitting on a motel bed in yesterday's clothes, and behind the gray exhaustion of his face was something Raphael recognized the way you recognize something you've seen in a mirror. The specific look of a man who has made a decision that felt like logic in the moment and has discovered, upon seeing its consequences, that it was something else. "Costa's plan for last night," Raphael said, "was not a vote." Marco looked up. "There was a man at the window," Raphael said. "Young. 30, maybe. He moved when I pushed Costa directly. Reyes walked in before it became what it was going to become." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He watched his son understand it, watched the color go out of his face entirely, the remaining gray becoming something more absolute. He watched Marco's hands press harder between his knees. "He told me—" "He lied to you," Raphael said, "because you were useful, because you had access to something he needed, and he gave you the story that would get him what he wanted from you. That's how Costa works. He finds what a person needs to hear, and he says it." He paused. "You're 29, and you grew up in this world, and you still got played by a man who's been running this game since before you were born. That's not stupidity, that's inexperience. But it cost us, Marco. It almost cost—" He stopped. "I know what it almost cost," Marco said, and his voice cracked on it. Not broke, cracked, which was different, which was the sound of a man holding himself together by main force. "I know, Pop. I know." They were both quiet. Raphael looked at the window, closed blinds, the gray morning pressing through the gaps. "Dante," Raphael said. Marco looked up. "You're going to Portland," Raphael said, "tonight. You're going to stay with your brother for a while. Not because I'm punishing you, because the situation here is going to be complicated for the next several months, and I need to know you're out of it. Can you do that?" Marco looked at him for a long moment. "You're not—" He stopped. "You're not sending me away. I'm sending you somewhere safe while I clean up what Costa built. When it's clean, you come back and we figure out what your role looks like going forward. But that conversation is not tonight." Marco nodded, a small movement, but real. Then, "The professor, is she—" "She's all right," Raphael said. "I didn't know he was going to— I know," Raphael said. "I know you didn't." He looked at his son one more time. "Call me when you land." He left. He didn't hug him, didn't put a hand on his shoulder, didn't do any of the things that the moment seemed to call for, because the moment wasn't ready for those things yet, and pretending it was would have been a lie, and he was done with lies in all their forms. The accounting between them was real, and it was going to take real time and real conversation to work through, and doing any of that in a motel room in Orland Park on no sleep would have cheapened it. Some things required the right conditions. He'd learned that from a woman who studied history, OAC. The next 72 hours were operational. Costa's arrest had sent a fracture through the network that required immediate management. Not violent management, which was the old reflex, the first-generation response, but the specific kind of careful structural management that determined which alliances were salvageable and which were finished, which men had been genuinely compromised and which had simply been adjacent to the compromise, which parts of the operation were contaminated by the FBI's interest and which were clean enough to continue. He worked with two men from the inner circle who had been outside Costa's reach, both of them younger, both of them chosen for the kind of analytical intelligence that was different from the operational intelligence most of the men around him had. He worked for 16 hours the first day and 12 the second, and by the third day, the shape of it was clear enough to move on. Fabry was finished. He'd accepted a plea arrangement and was cooperating with Reyes's investigation, which meant the docks operation needed new management. Enzo Marchetti had disappeared. Not Orland Park disappeared, but actually gone, which meant he'd had an exit plan and had been running it the moment his phone went dark. The two East Side captains were arrested the morning after the commission meeting on charges connected to Sal's proffer. Sal himself was somewhere in federal protective custody, working through his immunity deal, and Raphael did not think about Sal more than was necessary because the Sal accounting was a different kind of wound from the Marco wound. Older, in a way, because the betrayal had been slower and more deliberate and had involved a man who'd had full adult understanding of what he was doing, which made it cleaner in some ways and worse in others. Reyes called on the third morning. Costa's attorney is filing motions, but the financial documentation is solid. He's looking at 12 to 15 years minimum. The New York component complicates things for them, but that's their problem. A pause. The woman who built the financial trail, she going to be available to consult with our forensic accounting team? You'll have to ask her, Raphael said. Can you give me a number? He thought about it for a moment. Then he gave Reyes Evelyn's number, and he thought about the conversation that was going to happen, and he thought that Evelyn was going to find it interesting. The forensic accounting angle, the way the financial trail mapped to historical patterns, the specific methodology of it. She was going to find it genuinely interesting, and she was going to be both rigorous and difficult to manage, which was going to be Reyes's problem. And he found, to his own mild surprise, that he was looking forward to hearing her account of it afterward. He called Evelyn after he hung up with Reyes. An FBI agent is going to call you. About the documents? Yes. All right, she said. Is it the woman from the diner? How do you know about the woman from the diner? Your man in the lobby told me who you left with that morning, she said. I looked her up. She's written 2 papers on financial networks and organized crime. She's competent. A pause. I'll talk to her. But the meeting happened on the 8th day. Not a commission meeting. Those were going to be complicated for a while, the commission's credibility requiring its own reconstruction after the exposure of what Costa had built inside it. This was a smaller meeting, 6 family heads in a private house in the western suburbs, and it was arranged by a man named Tomasello, who was 70 years old and had been the most senior voice in the national organization for longer than some of the men at the table had been alive. Tomasello was the reason the commission still functioned as anything beyond a formality, not because he was the most powerful man in the room, but because he was the most respected, and respect was not the same thing as power, and was frequently more durable. He had requested Raphael's presence and had specified that it was a request, not a summons, which was its own kind of message. Raphael drove there himself. Carmine sat in the car. The house was large and old and set back from the road behind a stand of mature oaks that reminded Raphael, painfully and briefly, of the garden at Aldermere Drive. He was led in by a man he didn't know and brought to a sitting room where Tomasello was already there, alone, which was not what he'd expected. The 6-family meeting was apparently not the meeting. The meeting before the meeting was. Tomasello was a small man, which surprised people who hadn't met him before, because the reputation came large. He was sitting in an armchair with a glass of water on the table beside him, and he looked at Raphael the way very old men sometimes look at things. with the attention of someone who has seen enough versions of enough situations that they're reading what's in front of them against a catalog of significant size. Sit down, Raphael. Raphael sat. Costa is going to prison, Tomasello said. The New York situation is being resolved. The East Side captains are going to trial, and the outcome is not uncertain. He folded his hands in his lap. The damage to the Commission's credibility is significant, but not fatal. We've had worse. He paused. What I want to talk to you about is something else. Tell me. The woman. He said it without particular weight, not accusatory, not dismissive. A simple introduction of the subject. Evelyn Brooks. She built the case. Yes. She's a retired professor. History, Westbrook College. Tomasello looked at him for a moment. How did she find the routing? She recognized a pattern. Financial structures in late Republican Rome. She'd been looking at the foundation documents I showed her, and she saw something that matched a pattern she knew from academic research. Raphael paused. She told me she almost didn't bring it to me because she wasn't sure it was what she thought it was. She spent 6 weeks double-checking before she said anything. Tomasello was quiet for a moment. She knew it was dangerous. Yes. And she documented it anyway. She's a historian, Raphael said. She documents things. It's what she does when she encounters something important. Something moved in Tomasello's face that might have been the very old man's version of amusement. The men, some of the men, have been saying you've been distracted, softened, that the relationship represented a lapse in your judgment. I know what they've been saying. What do you say? Raphael thought about the 14 months. The corridor at the theater, Thucydides in a folding chair, the kitchen table and the coffee, and the way Herodotus had climbed onto his jacket. The envelope she'd put on the table between them. The way she'd said, "Don't be slow" when he left her apartment the night before the commission meeting. The specific calibrated instruction of a woman who understood the situation more completely than anyone else in it. I say that the woman they called my weakness is the reason Costa's in federal custody instead of running the organization he spent 11 months trying to take, Raphael said. And I say that the men who were watching me and measuring me and reporting back to Costa were so focused on what the relationship looked like from the outside that they never asked what it actually was, which is exactly the kind of error that gets people in trouble. Tomasello looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. A single, slow nod, the kind that carries weight because it's rare. The 6 men in the next room, he said, have questions about the operation, about leadership, about where things stand. He paused. None of those questions are about the woman. I want you to understand that. I understand. Good. Tomasello reached for his water. One more thing. Your son. Raphael kept his face arranged. I know what happened, Tomasello said simply. I know what Costa told him, and I know what he gave Costa, and I know he's in Portland now. He paused. He's young. Yes. He made a young man's mistake. He believed someone who told him what he wanted to hear about his father's future. Tomasello set down the water. That's not an excuse, but it's a category. There's a difference between a man who betrays you for gain and a man who betrays you because he was afraid of losing you, and someone handed him a story that made the betrayal feel like protection. Raphael looked at the old man. That's a generous reading. I'm old enough to afford generosity on things that don't require harshness, Tomasello said. Harshness is for the things that actually require it. Your son is not one of those things. He paused. Bring him home when it's time. Give him something real to do and hold him accountable for it. That's what you do with a young man who made a mistake. Raphael nodded. Not because he fully agreed, not yet. The wound was still too recent for full agreement. But because the direction of it was right, and Tomasello had been doing this long enough that right directions deserved acknowledgement, even when you couldn't fully arrive at them yet. The other room, Raphael said. Whenever you're ready. The 6 family heads were not hostile. That was the first thing Raphael registered walking in. They were cautious. They were measuring. They were doing the thing men in rooms like this always did, which was reading the person in front of them against the story they'd been given and adjusting. But they were not hostile. and hostile was what Costa had needed them to be for his plan to work, which meant that without Costa in the room shaping the narrative, they were back to their own assessments. And their own assessments, it turned out, of a man who had just exposed and dismantled a conspiracy against the Commission itself, were more favorable than the assessments Costa had spent 11 months trying to manufacture. The meeting lasted 2 hours. It was not easy. There were hard questions about the East Side operation, about the FBI's ongoing investigation, about the structural integrity of the DeLuca network after the removals of Sal, Fabri, Enzo, and the 2 captains. Questions about succession planning, about the next tier of leadership, about what the organization looked like in 12 months. Raphael answered every question directly. He did not minimize the damage or overstate his recovery. He described what had been lost and what remained and what he was going to build from what remained. And he did it with the specific authority of a man who has been through something and is not pretending it didn't happen. He was 90 minutes into it when one of the 6, a man from Philadelphia named Caruso, 60, careful, one of the men Costa had approached and who had declined to be drawn in, asked the question Raphael had been waiting for since he walked in. "The woman," Caruso said, "going forward. What's her role?" The room got its specific attention quality. 6 men waiting. Raphael looked at Caruso. "She doesn't have a role in the organization," he said. "She's not part of the operation. She's not going to be consulted on business decisions or have any formal position." He paused. "She's the person I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. That's her role. And if anyone in this room or outside of it decides that's a problem, they should look very carefully at what happened to the last man who made it his problem." The room was quiet. Caruso nodded, slowly, carefully, with the weight of a man who'd asked the question because it needed asking and was satisfied with the answer. "Fair enough," he said. The other 5 said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The meeting ended at 4:30. Raphael drove back into the city as the evening came in from the east, the light going amber and long across the buildings, and he called Evelyn from the car. "How did it go?" she said. "It went," he said. "I'll tell you tonight." "Tomasello." He paused. "How do you know about Tomasello?" "I've been reading about the commission structure since January," she said. "He's the institutional memory. Of course he was going to want to talk to you separately." A beat. "Was he reasonable?" "He was," Raphael said. "He said something about Marco." "What did he say?" "He said there's a difference between a man who betrays you for gain and a man who betrays you because he was afraid of losing you." Silence on the line. Not empty silence, the particular full silence of a person taking something in. "He's right," she said. "I know." "Have you called Marco?" "Not yet." "Tonight," she said. "Call him tonight. Not to resolve everything, just to call. So he knows you're still—" She paused, choosing the word. "Reachable." Mom, he thought about this. He thought about Portland and Dante's family and his grandson who was 3 and had never met the grandfather who sent birthday presents through an intermediary because the grandfather's address was not something Dante's household needed to have in it. He thought about a version of a phone call that didn't try to solve anything but just opened a line that had been closed. "Tonight," he said. He put the phone in his pocket. The car moved through the evening city. Carmine was doing the thing he did, which was being present without intrusion, which after 22 years had become its own sophisticated form of care. "Carmine," Raphael said. "Yeah. After tonight, after I make the call to Marco, I'm going to need a few days." Carmine glanced in the rearview mirror. "The professor?" "Yes." "I'll arrange coverage," Carmine said. "You won't even know it's there." Raphael looked out the window. The city was doing its evening thing, the lights coming on in the buildings, the streets filling with the dinner-hour traffic, the ordinary machinery of millions of lives that had no idea what had happened in a 14th-floor room 8 days ago, or a sitting room in the western suburbs this afternoon, or a motel in Orland Park, or a faculty apartment building on the north side, where a woman had packed a bag 3 days before anyone else understood that packing was necessary. He thought about what came next. Not the operational next. That was already moving, already being managed, the structural repairs and the personnel decisions, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust in a network that had been compromised at multiple levels. That next was known, or known enough. He could work that next. He thought about the other next, the one that lived in the space between the operational world and everything else. The professor who studied empires and their collapses, and who had looked at his empire and seen its structural failures before he had documented them and waited and timed her revelation with the patience of a woman who understood that the right information at the wrong moment was worse than no information at all. The car stopped at a light. A woman crossed the street pushing a stroller, and beside her a man was walking a dog, and they were talking about something and laughing, and the light changed and the car moved, and Raphael watched them until they were behind him. He called Marco. It rang 3 times. Then, "Pop." "Yeah," Raphael said. "It's me. Just checking in." A long pause. Then Marco said, "I'm here." His voice was rough. Dante showed me around the office today, the landscape place." "Yeah?" Marco stopped. "He's good at it. I didn't know he was that good at it." "He always was," Raphael said. "You were too young to see it." Another pause. The city moved past the windows. "Pop, I need to tell you." "Not tonight," Raphael said. "Tonight I just wanted to call. Everything else—" He paused. "Everything else can be tomorrow." Silence on the line. The specific full silence of a young man holding something enormous and being told, gently, that he doesn't have to hold it alone and doesn't have to set it down immediately either. That there's time. That time is in fact one of the things left. "Okay," Marco said. "Okay. Yeah." "Call me tomorrow," Raphael said. He hung up. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked out the window at the city that had no idea, that went about its business in full confident ignorance of everything that had just been decided in rooms it would never see, and he felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, not yet. Peace was further out than tonight. But something adjacent to it, something like the beginning of the thing adjacent to peace lasted approximately 14 hours. Then Enzo Marchetti came back. Not to surrender, not to negotiate. Enzo came back because he'd spent 9 days running the math on his situation and had arrived at a calculation that had a specific and brutal logic to it. Costa was in federal custody and was going to stay there. The network Enzo had aligned himself with was dismantled, and the man he'd betrayed was still standing, which meant Enzo had nowhere to go that Raphael's reach didn't eventually extend. And the only move left that gave him any leverage at all was the one he'd been holding back, the one he'd been saving for exactly this kind of corner. He called Raphael's direct line at 7 in the morning, 10 days after the commission meeting. Raphael was at Evelyn's apartment, at the kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of him, watching her annotate something on a yellow legal pad that Agent Reyes had sent over the previous afternoon. Herodotus was on the windowsill. The morning was gray and ordinary. The phone rang and Raphael looked at the number and felt something tighten in his chest before he answered. "Enzo, I have something you want." Enzo's voice had the specific texture of a man who hadn't slept in several days. Rough, slightly too careful, the over-controlled diction of someone managing their own fear by monitoring every word. "Something I've been holding since before the warehouse, something Costa didn't know I had." "Talk. Not on the phone, in person, just you." A pause. "I'm not stupid enough to think I walk away from this clean. But I walk away. That's the deal. I give you what I have, and I walk away, and you don't come after me." Raphael looked at Evelyn. She had stopped writing. She was looking at him with the full attention look, reading his face. He stood up and walked to the window, not for privacy, but because he needed to be moving. "What do you have, Enzo?" "Your son," Enzo said. "I have documentation of everything Marco gave Costa. Dates, content, method of contact, everything. Which means I also have the counter to it. I can show you where Costa manipulated what Marco gave him, where he fabricated context around it to make it look worse than it was. Marco thought he was helping you avoid a war. Costa told him the vote was going to happen regardless, that you'd already agreed to step down quietly, and that Marco's help was just smoothing a transition you'd already accepted. A pause. Your son didn't know he was handing Costa a weapon. He thought he was confirming a decision you'd already made. The tightening in Raphael's chest moved somewhere else. Not relief, not yet. The information could be true, or it could be another layer of Enzo's survival strategy, and distinguishing one from the other required seeing the documentation. But the shape of it, the specific shape of it, fit with things Raphael already knew. Marco's face in that motel room, the way he'd said I didn't know it was going to be, the crack in his voice that had sounded like genuine devastation rather than fear of consequences. Where? Raphael said. Enzo gave him a location, a storage facility in Cicero, a unit he'd had under a name that wasn't his. He said he'd be there at noon. He said he'd come alone. He said, again, with the desperate precision of a man who understood he was out of other options. Just you, Raphael. If Carmine walks in that door, I'm gone and everything I have goes with me. Raphael said, noon. He hung up. He turned from the window. Evelyn was watching him with the expression she wore when she was doing the thing she did, which was reading everything simultaneously, the content and the context and the spaces between them. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it, including the part about Marco. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, it fits. It might fit because Enzo built it to fit. Yes, she said. It might. She set down her pen. But consider what he's offering. If the documentation shows the fabrication, shows where Costa took what Marco gave him and constructed a worse version of it, then Marco's culpability changes significantly. Not disappears. Changes. She paused. Enzo knows that's the one thing you can't afford not to see. Which is exactly why it might be constructed. Yes. She looked at him. You're going to go anyway. Yes. Because even a 10% chance that it's real is worth the risk. He said nothing, which was its own answer. She stood up. I'll come. Evelyn, not inside, she said in the tone that did not invite argument. I'll be in the car. With Carmine. She looked at him steadily. You're not walking into a storage facility in Cicero alone to meet a man who has nothing left to lose. That's not caution, Raphael. That's stubbornness dressed as competence. I'll be in the car. He looked at her for a long moment. The gray morning was coming through the kitchen window, and her silver hair had the light in it, and she was standing at her kitchen table in her sweater and reading glasses with the absolute unfrightened directness that had started this whole thing in a theater corridor 16 months ago. And he thought, not for the first time, that the men who had called her his weakness had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of strength. In the car, he said. You stay in the car. In the car, she agreed. The storage facility was a long, low building off a commercial strip in Cicero, the kind of place that existed in every middle ring of every American city. Fluorescent lit corridors, roll-up metal doors, the smell of dust and old cardboard, and the particular sadness of things people weren't ready to throw away. Carmine drove. Evelyn sat in the back with Raphael and didn't say anything on the drive, which was its own form of presence. They pulled into the lot at 11:55. Enzo's car was already there, a rental, plates Raphael didn't recognize, parked at the far end of the lot facing the exit. The planning of the exit-facing park was either instinct or instruction, and either way it told Raphael something about where Enzo's head was. Unit 47, Enzo had said. Down the second corridor, left-hand side. Raphael got out. He looked back at the car once. Evelyn was watching him through the window with the steady, unornamented look of a woman sending someone into something difficult and trusting them to come back. No theatrics. No fear performed for his benefit. Just the look. He went in. The corridor smelled like every storage corridor smelled. His footsteps on the concrete were the only sound. Unit 47 had its roll-up door raised halfway, and he crouched under it without stopping, because stopping in a doorway was something he'd trained out of himself 30 years ago. Enzo was inside. He looked terrible. 9 days of running had compressed onto his face, the lines deeper, the eyes carrying the specific hollowed quality of sustained fear. He was standing near the back wall beside a folding table on which sat a manila envelope and a small external hard drive. He had his hands visible, which Raphael noted. "You came alone," Enzo said. "I came," Raphael said. "Show me." Enzo opened the envelope. Inside were printed pages, phone records, text transcripts, a document that appeared to be a summary memo in Costa's consigliere's handwriting. Raphael stepped forward and looked at them without touching. He read carefully. His face did not change. The phone record showed the contact between Marco and Costa's intermediary over a 6-week period. The texts were operational, Marco providing information about the documents, about the timeline, about what Raphael had told him. Reading them in sequence was not easy, but between the texts, in the summary memo that appeared to have been written by Costa's consigliere as a briefing document, was the fabrication Enzo had described. Costa had told Marco in a recorded conversation that the memo summarized that Raphael had privately agreed to a leadership transition at the commission meeting, that the step down was already decided, that Raphael himself had asked Costa to manage the process to protect the family's reputation. Marco's assistance, Costa had said, was simply helping ensure the transition happened smoothly, without the evidence surfacing and complicating what Raphael wanted. It was clean work. Costa had given Marco a story in which betraying his father was an act of loyalty to his father's wishes, in which the evidence Marco handed over was something Raphael would have wanted handed over, in which the son wasn't destroying his father, but protecting him from the embarrassment of a public confrontation. Marco had believed it because he'd needed to believe it, because the alternative, that he was being used to destroy the man he was afraid of losing, was unbearable, and Costa had understood that and had built his lie with precision around the exact shape of what Marco needed the truth to be. Raphael set the pages down. He breathed. He looked at the wall behind Enzo for a moment, at nothing, at the painted cinder block of a storage unit in Cicero at noon on a Tuesday, and he let the full weight of the thing settle. Then he looked at Enzo. "The drive," he said. "Everything's on it. The original files, the audio of Costa's conversation with Marco, the full memo series." Enzo paused. "I've been holding it since before the warehouse. Insurance, in case Costa decided I knew too much." "Why didn't you use it before the commission meeting?" "Because before the commission meeting, Costa was still the winning side." Enzo said it without apology, which Raphael respected more than an excuse would have deserved. "I use it when it's useful. Now it's useful." Raphael looked at him for a moment. Enzo looked back, not defiantly, not submissively, just with the exhausted honesty of a man who has burned through every performance he had available and is down to what's actually true. "The deal you asked for," Raphael said. "Walk away. That's all. I disappear. You don't come after me." Raphael picked up the drive. He put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up the pages, refolded them, put them in the envelope, and put the envelope in his other pocket. He looked at Enzo one more time. "You have 48 hours to be somewhere I'm not going to accidentally find you," he said. "After 48 hours, you're not my problem. But Enzo," he paused, "if you surface in a way that causes me a problem, if you talk to anyone who talks to anyone, if any of this ends up somewhere it shouldn't, the deal ends. You understand that?" "I understand." "Go." Enzo went. He didn't thank him, which was the right call, and he moved quickly, which was the right instinct. Raphael stood in the storage unit for a moment after he was gone, alone in the fluorescent light and the smell of dust, holding the evidence that changed the shape of something he'd been carrying for 10 days. He walked back out to the car. Evelyn looked at his face when he got in. She read it the way she read everything. "The documentation was real," she said. "Yes." "And Marco?" "Costa built him a lie that made the betrayal feel like loyalty." He paused. "Marco didn't know what the room was for. He thought he was confirming a transition I'd agreed to. He thought he was protecting me from a public fight I'd already decided to avoid." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's not innocence," she said carefully. "No. He still made choices he shouldn't have made. He still went outside the family to an adversary. He still—" "I know," Raphael said. "I know all of that. But the calculation changes." He looked out the window. "The calculation changes." She reached over and took his hand, not softly, firmly, the way she did everything, with the full weight of the intention behind it. He held it. "Call him," she said. "I will. Not tonight. Now." From the car. He looked at her. She looked back. He called Marco. It rang twice. "Pop, I need to tell you something," Raphael said. "I found documentation of the conversations between you and Costa's intermediary. All of it, including the recording of what Costa told you about the transition, about what I'd agreed to." He paused. "I know what he told you. I know what you thought you were doing." Silence on the line, a long silence, and inside it Raphael could hear his son breathing, shallow, rapid, the breathing of someone trying to hold themselves together across a phone connection from Portland while their father says the thing they've been waiting 10 days to hear. "Pop, I swear I didn't know." "I know," Raphael said. "I know you didn't know." He paused. "You should have come to me, before any of it. Whatever Costa told you, whatever he said I'd agreed to, you should have come to me directly. That was the mistake, not the intention, the choice to believe something about me without asking me." "I know," Marco said, and his voice broke on it this time, fully broke, and he didn't try to stop it. I know, Pop." "Okay," Raphael said. "Okay." He paused. "Come home next week. We'll talk." A long exhale. "Yeah. Okay. Yeah." Raphael hung up. The car was quiet. Outside, Cicero moved past as Carmine pulled out of the lot. The commercial strip, the ordinary Tuesday noon traffic, the world going about its business in full ignorance. Evelyn was still holding his hand. The months that followed were not easy, but they had the specific quality of difficult things that are moving in the right direction. A quality distinguishable from difficult things that are simply difficult by the presence, underneath the hardness, of something that holds. The FBI's case against Costa built steadily through the fall. Sal Benedetti's testimony, combined with Evelyn's financial documentation and the forensic accounting work she did in 3 sessions with Reyes's team, sessions that Raphael heard about secondhand through Reyes's increasingly respectful references to your Dr. Brooks, constructed a case that the federal prosecutor called one of the most thoroughly documented commission corruption prosecutions in 20 years. Costa's attorneys were skilled, and the motions were numerous, and the process was slow, the way federal processes were always slow. But the outcome was not uncertain. Evelyn consulted with Reyes's team on a Tuesday and Thursday pattern for 6 weeks. And then the active consultation ended, and she went back to her apartment and her books and Herodotus and the research she'd set aside for 6 months, which was a paper on financial patronage networks in the late Roman Republic that she told Raphael, with the mild amusement of someone enjoying an irony, had turned out to have some very current applications. Raphael rebuilt the operation carefully. Not restored. Rebuilt, which was different, which meant making deliberate choices about what to keep and what to let go, what structures had enabled the corruption and what structures could resist it. He brought in a new consigliere, a woman in her 40s named Teresa Moran, who had spent 15 years as a financial investigator before circumstances that were their own story had brought her to his attention. He restructured the captaincy system in a way that reduced the concentration of power that had made Enzo and the East Side men viable targets for Costa's approach. He moved slowly, and he moved carefully, and he moved with the specific patience of a man who had learned, at significant cost, that the speed he'd always trusted was not always the right instrument. Marco came home in October. He sat across the desk in the study at Aldermere Drive, and they talked for 3 hours. Not the operational talk, not yet, but the other talk, the harder talk, the one about what had happened and why, and what it said about the space between them that had allowed a man like Costa to find purchase in it. It was not a comfortable conversation. There were things said in it that were true and sharp, and landed the way true sharp things land. There were silences that had weight, but it moved, and it concluded, and when Marco left that afternoon, he left differently from the way he'd left the motel in Orland Park. Not resolved, not finished, but inside something instead of outside it. Raphael gave him the docks operation in November. Not Fabri's old structure, a rebuilt version, smaller, cleaner, with clear accountability built into it. He gave it to him and held him to it, which was what Tomasello had said, and what Raphael had understood, and what was both harder and more useful than any other thing he could have offered. In December, on a Saturday morning with the first real cold of winter coming through the garden, Raphael drove to Evelyn's apartment and arrived with a box. Not a large box. A cardboard box of the kind used for moving. Medium, solid, the flaps folded in on each other. He carried it up in the elevator and knocked, and she opened the door and looked at him and then at the box. "What is that?" she said. "It's a box," he said. "I can see that. I thought—" He paused. He was not a man who faltered over words generally. He had spent 30 years in rooms where words were instruments, where imprecision was dangerous, where what you said and how you said it carried consequences. And yet standing in her doorway with a medium cardboard box, he found himself briefly without the precise formulation. "There's a room at the house," he said, "on the east side. It gets good light in the morning. It's been a guest room for 12 years and nobody has used it, and I thought, if you wanted, you could use it for the research. When you're working on something that needs space, the desk in your apartment is—" "My desk is fine," she said. "Your desk has 17 stacks of papers on it, and Herodotus sleeps on 2 of them." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the box. Then she looked back at him with the expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The expression that had its own specific weight after 16 months of learning what it meant. "What's in the box?" she said. "Nothing yet," he said. "It's for whatever you want to bring." She considered him, the way she always considered things, fully, without the performance of consideration, just the real thing. He stood in her doorway with his empty box and felt the specific vulnerability of a man who has done something that cannot be taken back if it's received wrong, and waited. "One condition," she said. "Name it." "Herodotus comes." "Herodotus has always been welcome at the house." "He doesn't like you." "I know. I'm working on it." She stepped back from the door. He came in. She went to the kitchen and he set the box down in the living room and looked at the apartment. The books on every surface, the papers, the yellow legal pads, the framed photograph on the desk of a younger Evelyn with a man who must have been her husband, and beside it a more recent photograph of a young man holding a violin who must have been Marcus, her former student, the second violinist at the Westbrook Philharmonic, who sent her a ticket every October. A life arranged according to what mattered to her, entirely legible to anyone who looked. She came back with 2 cups of coffee. She sat. He sat. Herodotus materialized from somewhere and inspected the box with the judicial thoroughness of a cat encountering a new object, then sat beside it and looked at Raphael. "The paper," Raphael said. "The one about the Roman patronage networks." "Nearly finished. When it's done, I'd like to read it." She looked at him over her coffee. "It's an academic paper. The footnotes alone are 40 pages. I'll read the footnotes. You'll find them dry." "I found Thucydides dry the first time," he said. I kept reading. Something settled in her face. Not softening. That was never the right word for what happened in Evelyn's face. More like a recognition. The look of a person seeing something they'd been watching develop and finding it has arrived at the form they'd been waiting for. "All right," she said. "You can read it." They drank their coffee. Outside, the December cold pressed against the windows, and the city made its sounds, and Herodotus finished his inspection of the box and walked across the room and, with the absolute sovereign indifference of his kind, stepped up onto Raphael's knee and settled there. Raphael looked down at him. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was watching with the not-quite smile. "Progress," she said. "I told you I was working on it." They sat in the quiet of her apartment, and the coffee was better than anything served in any restaurant, and the December light was pale and clean through the windows, and between them on the table was an empty box waiting to be filled with whatever she decided to bring. The underworld that had mocked the Don who loved an older woman had gone quiet. Not because it had been silenced by force, though force had been part of it, but because the story had resolved itself into something that didn't fit the mockery anymore, something that required a different response from the men who'd watched it. The men who'd measured Raphael's deliberateness as hesitation and his patience as decline had watched that patience produce the most complete dismantling of a commission conspiracy in a generation, and the recalibration of that assessment had happened without announcement, the way real recalibrations always happen. Quietly, internally, in the privacy of men who don't admit when they've been wrong, but stop repeating the error. Costa was in federal custody awaiting trial. Sal Benedetti was in protective custody, reduced, finished, a man who would spend the remainder of his life in the diminished geography of a deal he'd made in a federal building at 4 a.m. Enzo Marchetti was somewhere Raphael was not looking for him, which was its own form of conclusion. Fabri was cooperating with prosecutors and living in the specific purgatory of a man who'd chosen the wrong side and was paying for it in increments. Marco was running the docks. He made mistakes and he was corrected, and he made fewer mistakes, and he was learning the thing that couldn't be taught except by doing. That the weight of responsibility had its own gravity, its own demand, its own way of forming a person if the person let it, instead of fighting it. Dante, in Portland, knew nothing specific and everything general, and had sent his father a text in November that said only, "Heard things went okay. Glad." To which Raphael had replied, "Come for Christmas. Bring the kids." To which Dante had replied, after a pause long enough to suggest genuine consideration, "Yeah, okay." The room on the east side of the Aldermere Drive house would have good light in the morning. The desk Raphael was going to put in it was already ordered. A large wooden desk, the kind built for serious work, chosen with input from a man who'd spent 20 minutes describing it, while Raphael tried to understand the difference between oak and walnut, and concluded that the difference mattered less than the fact of choosing carefully. There would be a space for the papers and the legal pads and the research that required room to spread out. There would be a window looking at the garden. There would be a chair for Herodotus, whether Herodotus chose to use it or chose to use Raphael's jacket instead, which was his established preference and at this point a matter of settled policy. And in the evenings, when the operational day was done, and the calls were finished and the city outside the Iron Gate went about its ordinary business, Raphael De Luca and Evelyn Brooks would sit at a table in a house that contained both of their lives, and they would talk about history and the nature of power and the things that empires forgot about themselves before they fell, and she would correct him when he was wrong, and he would listen when she was right, and neither of them would pretend that what they'd built was simple or clean or without cost. It wasn't. It had cost considerably. It had cost in the specific currency of trust and time, and the particular damage that comes from discovering the people closest to you are capable of the things closest people are capable of. Some of that cost was still being paid. Some of it would be paid for a long time. But cost and worth were not the same measurement. Raphael had known that since he was young, known it as a tactical fact, known it the way he knew the value of patience and the value of intelligence over force. He knew it differently now. Not as a tactic, as a condition of the life he was choosing to live, with the full understanding of what the choosing meant and what it required and what it was worth. The coffee cooled, the light moved. Herodotus shifted on his knee and resettled with the authority of an animal who has made a unilateral decision about comfort and expects it to be respected. "He's accepted you," Evelyn said. "Provisionally," Raphael said. "With Herodotus, provisional is the best available category." "Then I'll take it." She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside, the December city moved through its Saturday morning, and the story that had started in a theater corridor with a wrong turn and a woman reading Thucydides in a folding chair arrived in this small, warm room at the place where stories that are worth telling arrive. Not at an ending, exactly, but at the thing that makes an ending unnecessary. The place where what has been built is solid enough to stand in. The place where what has been survived has become, without announcement, the ground beneath your feet.